What is your forecast for Ukrainian economy in 2023 and 2024?
It all depends on if a war will end and to what extent Ukraine will get financial assistance. I wouldn't like to say anything about 2024, but a reasonable expectation is that the Ukrainian economy will stagnate in 2023.
An estimated budgetary shortfall is $5 billion monthly. Do you think Ukraine has short-term and long-term solutions to this? And if so, what are they?
What President Zelensky has stated is a shortfall of $38 billion for the budget itself, and then $17 billion for reconstruction. With regard to the $38 billion, the EU has committed $19 billion and the US $10 billion for the first 9 months. So this covers most of it. And then there's always a bit more coming from the World Bank, the European Investment Bank and VBRD. And what one would like to see is a new IMF program, which should provide about $4 billion or so each of 4 years. So it should be possible to cover it. On top of that, various bilateral donations from other countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, and Norway has just committed for 5 years more than 7 billion euro. So the budget situation looks much better this year than last year.
The banking system seems to be surviving in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the full-scale war, only 2 banks have closed. 2 Russian banks also were closed. The remaining 67 banks continue operating. How would you explain it? Do you think it is sustainable if the war continues?
This has been managed very well by the central bank, but non-performing loans in the banking system has increased sharply. It's quite remarkable that all the banks have survived apart from the 2.
In May 2022, the European Union suspended all tariffs and quotas on imports from Ukraine, including agricultural products and foodstuffs, for 1 year. Do you think it will be extended? And what are the perspectives for Ukrainian trade in general?
The European Commission has asked for it to be extended and that Ukraine should be included into the single market. This is extremely important, and I think that this is likely to come through.
Just a couple of words about metallurgy losses. The industry lost about 1/3 of its assets, including Azovstal, and the blockade of the seaports slowed down export. How critical is it for the economy, and what is the verdict for the heavy industry in Ukraine?
The industry has lost about 1/3 of its assets. I would think that it's more, given that both Azovstal and Ilyicha in Mariupol have been destroyed, and the production last year was only 30% of what it has been previously. The whole steel industry, metallurgical industry needs to be rebuilt. But of course, the question is how much that will be in territories that will be liberated, since much of it is in Donetsk Oblast. What remains is mainly in the Dnipro Oblast and in Zaporozhye Oblast. Since the only new steelworks is Interpipes, Dnipro Steel, there has to be a substantial restructuring of the metallurgical industry, but it should come back since Ukraine has uniquely good preconditions for metallurgy with all raw materials, good communications with the rivers and the Black Sea, and a strong metallurgical tradition.
Russian continuous attacks on energy infrastructure lead to the deficit of electricity and heat. How can Ukraine meet its own needs and start looking at export?
It does not look that bad now. It's about 38% of the capacity that is not used, but that pretty much corresponds to how much less the demand is. Ukraine can come back. There are certain elements that are difficult to replace, but that needs to be done. And Ukraine did export electricity to Europe before Russia started the bombings on the 10th of October. And it can come back and do so. The present Ukraine imports from Eastern Europe.
Can you comment on the importance of the grain initiative? Is it sustainable? Will Russia try to use it as a leverage? Will Ukraine be able to stay Europe's breadbasket?
Russia delays deliveries of grain through Istanbul by having excessively long inspections. So what I hear now is that it's 45 days delays, and harvest last year was down by over 40%. So of course Ukraine is suffering badly, but Ukraine is still a big exporter of grain.
The labor force is suffering due to migration or conscription and the displacement of population. How does this aspect influence the economy?
Of course, GDP last year was 30% less, and that means that you need correspondingly less smaller labor force.
Financial support to Ukraine covered almost half of total needs in 2022, but is provided partly as loans, adding to the debt burden. Ukraine presses for a multi-billion-dollar borrowing program to cover its funding needs. What alternative forms of financing are there? Post-conflict reconstruction will require an estimated 315 billion euros to maybe 500 billion euros. Should these funds come from confiscated and frozen funds of Russian oligarchs and the Russian Central Bank? Should there be international legislation? Are there right mechanisms in place?
I think that everybody is aware that there must be much more financing, and the big thing should be to take to confiscate the frozen funds of the Russian Central Bank that are being held in the West. That's slightly more than $300 billion, and this has to be done. Unfortunately, the Western central banks and the ministries of finance and ministries of justice are strongly against this for no good reasons. So it's necessary that the parliaments push it through, and most of all this should be the US Congress.
Do you think the sanctions against Russia are working? What would be an ideal package?
I do think that they have substantial effect, and a plausible assumption is that the real decline in the Russian GDP last year was 4%, and that it will be about the same this year. What is now particularly effective is the oil price cap that could reduce the Russian export revenues by about a quarter altogether. So that's very important. Last year, the financial sanctions were not very effective because Russia earns so much from higher oil and gas prices. Another part of the sanctions that I think is very effective is the export controls that means that Russia doesn't get much technology.
It would be really interesting to hear what you think about the overall impact of the war in Ukraine on the world economies on the global scale.
Well, there are two relevant impacts. One is food prices because of the Russian blockade of Black Sea ports of Ukraine, and also that they have hindered so much of the production of agricultural goods in Ukraine. And another part of that is that all the fertilizer production in Ukraine has effectively been stopped. And also Russian and Belarusian exports of fertilizer have been hindered. So this is increasing the prices of food throughout the world. And last year we saw that the oil and gas prices increased in the whole world, and particularly in the gas prices in Europe. But now it seems that both oil and gas prices have fallen quite sharply. The gas prices in Europe are down by more than 80% from the peak in August. And it looks as if the situation is normalizing faster than expected. And as a consequence of this, none of the G7 countries is now expecting a decline in GDP apart from Britain. And there, the cause is Brexit rather than the situation, the war in Ukraine. Good luck. Take care.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.